I usually launch a new season of the Little Woman podcast during the spring, but this year I thought maybe I could make some extra episodes and publish them around the holidays. Today I'm going to read you a fanfic, and I wrote this one. If any of you guys have written canon-based Little Woman fanfiction that you think I would like and my listeners would like, feel free to message me. I am happy to read those stories in the podcast. I often wondered what happened during the engagement period that Joe and Friedrich had, and I love reading fanfiction that takes place during that time. So this one takes place at the time of Joe's and Friedrich's engagement. As always, you can find Little Woman podcast books on Amazon, and you can join my free newsletter at littlewomanpodcast.substack.com. All the links are in the description. This is the Little Woman Podcast Extra and fanfiction reading of The Photo Album. This takes place around New Year. Joe is visiting Friedrich and the boys in Boston. The Photo Album. All right, boys, it is time to say goodnight to Joe. Little Emo smiled, grinning so widely Joe could see the place of the missing tooth. She had fed him apples during the day until the loosened teeth got stuck and was easy to pull out. Good night, Tante Joe, Emo said, waved his hand, and his black curly head disappeared to the boy's room. Yeah, good night, Tante, Franz said, but when he was about to follow his brother, he suddenly turned around and ran into Joe's arms. Oh, Joe said, surprised in a kind tone. She hugged the boy and stroked his sandy hair when Franz quietly whispered to her ear, Tante, I'm so happy that you and Uncle are going to get married. Me too, my dear, Joe said. She watched how Franz disappeared to the room with his striped pajamas and morning robe. I don't know how you do it, Fritz. Those are the most well-behaved boys I have ever met. And I have known many boys. Friedrich had been adding more logs to the fireplace, and he had suddenly felt quite emotional seeing Franz hugging Joe. From the two boys, he was a bit more reserved than his brother, and it was amazing to see him opening up with Joe. I think he has missed having a motherly person around, my shots. Having you here does great good to him. Poor lad, how much he must miss his mother. I know I would, and you, my dear, you must miss your sister terribly. Ah, I do sometimes. I don't think I have ever showed you her picture. I would love to see it, Joe said and sat to the plush-covered couch. Friedrich sat next to her, holding an old thick photo album in his hands. He gave it to Joe. She let her fingers slide over the leather cover, something that she always did with books of all kinds. The pages were heavy and rustic, almost like maple leaves. Friedrich wrapped his arm around Joe's shoulder. I am sad most of my family is gone, but I have two and the boys. I could not ask for more. Oh, it's you. You are so cute. Joe looked at the first picture. It was a family portrait. A tall man was standing on the background. He had Friedrich's figure and sleek moustache, and thick curly hair. The man looked stern, but he lacked the warmth that Friedrich had in his eyes. Next to him was a woman sitting on a chair. She smiled, unlike her husband, looking almost amused, like she knew a secret and thinking about it made her happy. Joe could not tell the color of her hair from the black and white picture, but she thought it must have been the same sandy color as with Franz. Her long hair was braided around her head in the good old German style. Das ist mein Vater, Ludwig, and mein Mutter, Elsa, and there we are, Minna and me. Joe would not stop smiling looking at little Friedrich, wearing a sailor suit and his hand protectively over his sister's shoulder. Jo also noticed that the image had been torn apart and then glued back together. The picture of the father had been teared off and glued back. Who did that? Jo puzzled. I did, Fritz answered. I told you before that my father left us when I was a boy. I was angry and tore every picture of him I could find. Minna did not like that, and she glued them all back together. I suppose her age protected her. She did not remember some of the things that I did. How could he just leave you all? He told us he was going to move away to find another job, and then send us money. Maybe that is what he meant to do at first. Later on I heard a rumor that there was another woman. Then he just disappeared. 10 years ago I heard he had died, somewhere in Austria. To be honest, I still don't know how to feel about it. He was a stranger to me. Mother was never quite the same after he left. Fredrik turned to look at Jo. With so much love in his eyes, Jo felt her cheeks warming up. Maybe it was the crackling fireplace. No one had ever looked at her the same way. My mother would have loved you, mein Schatz. If she was anything like you, I'm sure we would have get on capitally. Jo looked the following pictures, and Fredrik pointed out faces and telling their German names. And Frida with her new horse, Onkel Fredrik, the one Fredrik was named after, with his wife and children, cousin Felix and Johan in a boat with Fredrik's Oma Hilda. Oma was laughing so heartily, Jo wondered if Fredrik had inherited his laughter from her. More aunts and cousins, but Jo's favorites were the ones with her Fredrik on them. There was one photo where Fredrik must have been 8 or 9 years old. He was standing in front of a giant Christmas tree, his small face lighting up with excitement and finding a violin from the gift box. This is the violin you still have? Yeah, that is the one. My uncle Fritz gave it to me. In another photo, Fredrik was perhaps 14. He looked older. His hair was messy with brown curls all over. He looked quite muscular for a 14-year-old. His sleeves were wrapped, showing strong arms, and it looked like the photo was taken on a construction site. Here I am building a church. Impressed? Always. That is Uncle Fritz, Fritz said, and pointed out a man who looked a lot like the man who was sitting next to her. Uncle Fritz smiled and looked gentle, someone with sense of humor. He was a stout, bearded man, but his beard was white as snow, and he had a monocle. Jo recognized the next photo. Fredrik had told her that he used to work in a bookshop to fund his university education, and there he was surrounded by the works of Shakespeare, Goethe and Schiller. Uncle Fritz was my mother's brother. After father left, he was the one who took care of me. He passed away a few years before I came to America. He owned the bookstore at Handelsplatz, where I used to work. A wonderful man. He could never fully concentrate on one thing, so he was interested in everything. Music, philosophy, religion, psychology, aviation, photography. I believe he took most of these pictures. He would be so proud of you. Jo turned the page, and an old postcard fell into her lap. Oh my, it is New York. Jo turned the card around. There was a message written in elegant handwriting. Man reist nicht, anzukommen, sondern zu reisen. That is Goethe, is it not? Yeah, it translates. You do not travel to arrive, but to travel. Minna must have sent this to me in her first year in New York. On the page where the card had fallen, there was a photo of a happy young woman in her mid-20s. Minna Bear looked like she was ready to conquer the world. She had a silk ribbon covering her fine forehead, and her hands were filled with roses. This was taken on her birthday. She was very clever, worked as a secretary, then as an editor's assistant. We usually got along very well. But when she told me she was going to marry Hoffman and move to America, I was angry. I felt that she was wasting her life. You could not have stopped her. No, and if I had, the boys would not be here with us. You have not heard from the boy's father? No, it is better that way. He left my sister alone dying. My boys deserve so much better. Jo took Fredrik's hand into hers. I am so proud of you. There's a pattern in your family. Men leaving their children behind. But you, my Fritz, would never do that. You have broken the pattern. Jo looked at more pictures. Fredrik in the university. Fredrik between a group of teachers. In the end of the album, there was photos that Jo recognized. When she had been staying in New York, Miss Kirk had hired a photographer to take photos of her 2 girls and some of her favorite guests in the boarding house. Jo smiled warmly when she saw a group picture with Kitty in her arms and Minnie next to her holding the tail of her brown skirt. Fredrik was standing next to Jo holding little Tina, and Franz and Emil sitting on the floor looking as mischievous as ever. I had forgotten about this. It was a fun day, though Kitty was constantly worried if her eyes looked crooked. She reminded me of Amy sometimes. She always worried about her nose as a child. Yeah, it was a fun day. Do you remember how in New York we used to sit by the fire and discuss about everything in the evenings? Once you left, Fredrik paused. What? You can tell me. It was so quiet and empty. It felt like walls were falling down on me. I knew I could not come to tea, to have to be with my sister. But that is when I decided that I need to change, and I needed to change. I'm so glad you came to me, Jo said and kissed him. There they sat for a long time chatting. Candles flickered in the Christmas tree, and the logs cracked in the fireplace. Fredrik thought of that Christmas Eve when he was a little boy and a Christkind, and his uncle together had given the violin to him. Christkind was only present in spirit, of course, but it is the thought that counts. Yeah, uncle had been good to him. After Minna had passed, there were times when he did not know how he could overcome the grief, but he had known in his heart that he could look after the boys, just like his uncle had looked after him. Jo had been such a great help. She had lightened his heart that had been so heavy, even without him noticing it. What are you thinking? Jo asked, laying her brown head next to his shoulder. I was thinking that the Christkind has been especially kind to me this year, he said and smiled. The end. Here are some of my end notes. For those of you who don't speak German, Tante means an aunt, Oma is grandmother, and Schatz means treasure. It is not mentioned in the book that Fredrik's father left the family, but since he never really speaks about them, I always thought there was some deeper trauma behind it. And Minna's husband is not mentioned either, but then I thought this would explain why Fritz is such a family man. And Fredrik's grandmother is actually briefly mentioned in the book Little Men. In many parts of Germany, still today, the Christkind, the Christ child, is the one who brings presents for the children. I hope you enjoyed this little story and have a lovely Christmas if that is something that you celebrate, or Hanukkah. And I hope to see you all next year when the season 6 of Little Woman podcast begins. Thank you so much for listening. Take care and make good choices. Bye.